On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a realistic look at the Chinese economy, challenges and potentials. The Central Economic Work Conference sets the tone.
I love the concept of Wu Wei. Can you say it in a proper Chinese accent?
Wu Wei.
Wu Wei.
And the pursuit of harmony between life and work. From one of the hardest working professional women, media magnate Arianna Huffington. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. First up, a meeting which charts the course of China's economic policy going into the year 2019 has wrapped up in Beijing. The annual Central Economic Work Conference from China has laid out the policy priorities for the year ahead. These include the full pursuit of high-quality manufacturing to finely tuned fiscal policy. Before our discussion about this, take a look.
A roadmap for China's future economic development. Taking a consistent stance on major policies, Chinese senior officials charted the course for the nation's economy. In 2019, China will continue to pursue a proactive fiscal policy and prudent monetary policy. It also emphasizes that monetary policy should strike an appropriate balance between tightening and loosening to ensure reasonably ample liquidity, while proactive fiscal policy should be stronger and more efficient. The measures are part of government's efforts to foster high-quality development while stabilizing the financial sector. Experts say the nation's economy may face greater downward pressure in the new year, but add there's no need to be pessimistic.
We won't be facing some radical changes on the policy or on the internal environment. I think that's a good news. Despite all these difficulties, I think the government still have a lot of cards in hands. For instance, we can still have some more room to lower a required rate of reserve, lower our interest rate.
7 tasks will be prioritized for next year's economic development, including pushing for high-quality development of manufacturing sector, forming a stronger domestic market, speeding up reform of economic structure, and promoting comprehensive opening up. The meeting also called for a larger scale of tax cuts and reducing administrative fees.
Tax cuts will not only improve profitability of these private companies, be able to increase the funding and the financing ability for these businesses, but also promote or boost the efficiency of the government.
The meeting also pointed out that China is still in an important period of strategic opportunity, adding the country needs to take chances and speed up transformation of economic structure, improve capabilities of scientific innovation, and deepen the nation's opening up and reform.
For more discussion on China's future economic policy as a result of the Central Economic Work Conference, meet our panelists. Here in Beijing, Xu Sitao, Chief Economist of Deloitte China. In Hong Kong, we invited Hong Hao, the Managing Director and Head of Research from Bocom International. In Washington, D.C., Han Chuan, who is a former senior official of the Institute of International Finance and the IMF. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. I want to start with you, Mr. Xu. The shining point, as you see it, from the outcome of this year's annual economic conference, briefly.
Yeah, a few things. First of all, I think the conference has recognized there is a pressure on economic growth. Economic deceleration, I think, continues. Precisely because of that, the conference has pledged to use counter-cyclical measures. In other words, just more decisive fiscal tools and potentially monetary easing, and to cushion economic downturn potentially, and of course, external shock. And more importantly, I think the conference has also emphasized the importance of implementation of the trade, the trade talk between China and the United States.
Mr. Hong, go to you now about your takeaway from the Central Economic Work Conference.
Yeah, I think the meeting really re-emphasized the challenges ahead, and also emphasized that China has necessary policy tools to deal with the uncertainties. And also, I think the meeting review what had happened during 2018. It has been a challenging year, to say the very least. But I think going forward, China is ready to use policy instruments to support and stabilize growth.
Mr. Tran, of course, the international media has been jumping onto the story and about the detailed analysis of everything coming out of the World Conference. Your takeaway?
Well, I think the World Conference has given appropriate guidance for economic priorities for the next year, meaning promoting domestic consumption, which is already happening with domestic consumption this year, providing for more than 5 percentage points of growth, and that will be a key part of growth going forward. And secondly, promoting the services sector, which is already happening, with services growing by almost 8% year-over-year so far this year, while manufacturing and production less than 6%. So overall, appropriate priorities going forward.
Gentlemen, I want to analyze several points inside this statement coming out of the World Conference with you. First of all, about pressure turned into impetus. Secondly, about China's reform and how to deal with some of the biggest challenges, including the reform of the state-owned enterprises, and also about further reform and opening up, as well as how to prevent further challenges in the fiscal sector. Let's do it one by one. So, Mr. Xu, we noticed more than one time in the statement that there's talking about turning pressure into impetus. That's being said in so many different ways. You could find it almost in every paragraph. What does that say to you? What kind of pressure, what kind of impetus is most important?
Well, pressures are really coming from two fronts. External pressure is really about trade tensions. That's why to implement what was being agreed between China and the United States for the next, whether 80 days or 90 days, that's very important. So
according
that's really
to the statement, if I could just read a little bit, the exact line, it said to implement the consensus built at the China-U.S. heads of state meeting on the sideline of the G20 in Argentina, and push forward the discussion, negotiation of trade between China and the U.S. That's exactly the phrase being used here, Mr. Xu.
Yeah, so if I decipher, that statement, that really means greater market access. Now, the domestic pressure is really about deleveraging. The government has been trying very hard to reduce leverage for large state-owned enterprises and local government, but of course, it's challenging. So the emphasis from this report is on removing zombie companies. In fact, the report explicitly mentioned that market clearing price.
All right. Mr. Hong, of course, this topic has been discussed among many of us many times. This time, does it really mean that efforts going to be made in massive scale in order to achieve the goal?
I would say so, but I think it's a continuing theme throughout many conferences already. I think China has been trying hard to reform the SOEs, and I think in the last 3 years we're actually seeing the importance of SOE firms increasing in the Chinese economy, in the sense that these firms are getting more bank lending support, and also the percentage of contribution of these firms to the Chinese GDP is actually growing. So I think it's a sort of a byproduct of our successful supply side reform, because when you do this kind of reform, the upstream resource companies, that tend to be resource heavy and capital heavy, they're getting more support from the government.
But to you, what exactly is the kind of pressure? What exactly is the kind of impetus that can be built out of the pressure, Mr. Hong?
Yeah, I would say that the Chinese observers always have this saying that one needs a a good crisis to engineer a good reform, because that is the time, when you're forced to a corner, you have to make some changes, right? So it's kind of a philosophical way to look at it. I think impetus is really coming from outside as well. I think Sitao just now mentioned, some internal pressure, but also externally, we have a trade negotiation going on with the U.S. Because of that, we have seen China actually accelerated its reform and open process. For example, in the financial sector, now that the foreign investors can own a majority of stake in many of the financial industries.
Right. Mr. Tran, of course, what's being said out of the statement from the Central Economic Work Conference needs to be read in correlates with many of the other important statements coming from China recent days. For example, 40 years anniversary reform and opening up meeting, Chinese President Xi Jinping also said that China would learn from everyone. However, there's not so-called absolute teacher that China has to follow everything coming from the advice coming from that specific party. That's very interesting when you read what is going on right now. So how should we comprehensively understand where China is heading for in terms of pressure, in terms of impetus, and in terms of its potential policies? Mr. Tran, your understanding from Washington.
Yes, basically, since opening up 40 years ago, China has followed an export-driven growth strategy, manufacturing for export, opening up and invite foreign direct investment to build up manufacturing capacity. Going forward, with that potential being reduced, not only through trade tension but through the maturing of the global economy, it is clear that the future in China is, as I said before, lie more in developing domestic market, developing domestic consumption, and here particularly consumption of services. There's room for that to grow, particularly in education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. So I think that is clearly turning the pressure into something which is in China's interest in the long run. And secondly, in terms of quality of growth, I think the more China can roll out things like 5G communication network, artificial intelligence and so on, and also roll out infrastructure project in the rural areas, those things will also help promote growth going forward.
Mr. Xu, briefly?
Yes, I agree with what Mr. Tran has said. I think it's important to use fiscal levers to provide better safety net so that the economy can withstand all these challenges.
Mr. Xu, I also want to ask you further about the state-owned enterprise reform. Earlier you touched on that topic, but shall we go a little bit more in detail? According to the statement coming out of the Central Economic Work Conference, there is specific part dealing with how to reform the state-owned enterprises. For example, encouraging and stick to, as you said, the separation between politics and business management, the administration, and also the capital, as well as push forward the principle of fair competition. Meanwhile, the rule of law is also being emphasized, the so-called establishing and creating the rule of law system as well as the environment. How should we understand these key phrases?
I think all these key phrases essentially means China would like to improve corporate governance and reducing political interference. In fact, if some of this will be implemented to have some separation between politics and the business operation, and I think state-owned enterprises scope of business will be more narrowly defined. So, for example, in a sense, SOEs should only operate in the area where there's no perfect competition, because by default, state-owned enterprises would always get more preferential treatments in terms of access of capital, so on and so forth.
Well, Mr. Xu, certainly you have your own version of further interpretation of what exactly is the document.
Yeah.
That's your personal interpretation,
Yeah.
by the way. Mr. Hong also mentioned, related to the state-owned enterprises, there's also the capital market to establish transparent, open, and also lively or energetic, as well as the important capital market. How should we understand these adjectives in front of the capital market?
Yeah, that's many adjectives that we add in front of the
Well,
capital
I
market.
guess for someone who's been working for the capital market, you know better than we do. What does it mean?
Yeah, well, I think it basically means that people whoever that is operating in the market should let the market force do the determination in terms of pricing and also in terms of how they're getting financing support from the market to support its further growth. Now, I think for now, Sitao just mentioned, these firms may get some preferential treatments, because they're big, resourceful, and full of capital. So, when they want to grow, they can easily borrow money from the bank. Now, the side effect from that really is that, China's growth has been built upon leveraging. So, these firms, as they grow, they borrow more and more money, and because they have stable cash flow, they can actually service those debts, and therefore, the Chinese growth is actually a debt-fueled growth. So I think going forward, in order to let the smaller private firms to have a bigger role in the economy, I think we probably need to support them and give more guided lending support and more capital market support, for those guys to grow up.
But on the other hand, Mr. Tran, of course, one of the issues facing China, as being clearly stated from the outcome statement of the Central Economic Work Conference, is about the, in a way, the challenges facing China's financial market, the ups and downs, and it wants to avoid future crisis as a result of events happening elsewhere in the world. So, and as well as deleveraging, of course, that's always been a major theme for China's economic policy. So, Mr. Tran, how shall we understand now how that will be done, given the recent geopolitics, given the recent apparent trade war, and also given the transformation of the global economy?
Yes, I think that there have been, as I said, progress already made in that direction. First, in terms of deleveraging, if you look at the growth of credit to the non-financial sector in China, it has slowed down from 16% at the beginning of last year, 14% beginning of this year, and now less than 12%. Going forward, probably the pace of reduction may stay, but the rebalancing of the lending also has progressed, and very important, less from non-bank sources and more from official banking lending, which is, I think, a positive statement. Secondly, China has opening up through measures like the Bond Connect, Stock Connect, and opening up, allowing foreign entities to invest in domestic market in China. It is important a measure to improve the efficiency of the Chinese domestic capital markets.
Right.
And to the extent that China going forward will have current account deficit, that will be also important to attract capital flow to finance the deficit.
Right.
Overall, the trade tension is one deterrent to this plan coming to fruition, and therefore it is important that the effort to be made to reduce the trade tension.
I see. Mr. Hong, it is no secret that over the past few weeks and months, China has put out quite a number of new measures in order to open up the market, in order to level the playing field, that particularly in the financial sector. You see one new thing coming out almost every day, or probably more than one. Mr. Hong, how shall we and the market going to digest that? And meanwhile, when problems coming up, usually it comes together with new policies, right? There's no policy that could be perfect. So how to cushion some of the challenges as a result of early implementation of the new policies?
Yeah, I think it's keeping all the new policies are keeping strategists and economists very busy. I think going forward, the reason why we're having all this further reform really, is because of the trade negotiation and also some external pressure from this negotiation. But then having said that, many of the domestic Chinese industries has matured to such a level that it can withstand foreign competition in many ways. For example, the investment banking industry that I'm working in has grown sophisticated over the years, in a sense that, for example, many of the research products that we produce here in China by many of the Chinese investment banks rivals, or maybe sometimes even better, surpass the quality of many of the international firms. So it's not necessarily that just because the international firms have a very strong foothold in the global market, they can come into the Chinese market and start to compete away the profits of Chinese firms. I think because over the years Chinese firms has learned and grown and to such a competitive level that is competitive even if we allow foreign firms to come in.
So you're saying, Mr. Hong, China is ready?
I think so. In many ways. For example, the auto industry is another good example. I think China is able to make electrical cars that is just as good as Tesla, for example, and many of the Chinese electrical cars are making international debut and receive raving reviews from international observers. So I would say that many of the industries are more than ready.
Mr. Xu, China is ready.
Yeah, I fully agree.
What about that, the future competition? And what about the so-called cushioning of the challenges as a result of the early implementation of the brand new policies? Mr. Xu.
Well, I think these implementations are very important because all these critical, incremental changes, I think will make the negotiation go more smoothly.
Before we go, I do want to invite your wisdom, gentlemen, about some of the key words, because reform has been, and opening up has been repeatedly mentioned in the statement. Well, at the same time, stability has also been repeatedly mentioned in the statement. We could find them almost in every paragraph. How should we see the combination of these phrases? How should we reconcile, it seems, the different directions that these words are pointing to? Mr. Hong first.
Yeah, I would say that reform and open is really better to, it's a better way to stabilize the economy. The economy has grown to such a gigantic size and also has incorporated so many foreign forces into our domestic economy. So, unless you reform and open further, and invite foreign competition and to actually and help the Chinese firms to improve their games during competition, then you eventually reach a equilibrium that is more stabilizing than before. So I would say that reform and open is one of the better way to stabilize and grow the Chinese economy.
Got it. Mr. Tran, how do you see that as an observer of China?
Basically, those three elements, reform, opening up, and maintain and stabilize growth, always form the three essential part of policy approach in China. The key point is that the emphasis will change from time to time. So I think in the next year, 2019, while all three will be pursued, the emphasis probably will be more on stabilizing growth through appropriate fiscal and monetary policy, and particularly through supporting household sector and small and medium-sized enterprises.
Got it. And Mr. Xu, last but not least, very briefly, sir.
So for me, I think the shift from job creation to de-emphasizing economic growth rate, that's very important. If indeed the growth model moving to service area, then you don't need such high growth rate. So I think the policymakers have decided to tolerate the slower growth rate in order to have better quality of growth.
Xu Sitao, Hong Hao, Han Feng. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for joining us from Beijing, Hong Kong, and Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. The pursuit of harmony between life and work from one of the hardest working professional women, media magnate Arianna Huffington, right after. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The world's two largest economies looking horns probably grabbed the most headlines in 2018. It has never been a rosy road for relations between China and the U.S., but this year seems to be a particularly difficult time. And all that has been fully reflected in both countries' media. The whole year, the banners on China-U.S. trade tensions circulated daily, with speculations on each other's motives a big part of it. How much does the narrative capture the reality, though? What should be the role of the media in that regard? On sidelines of Understanding China International Conference, I sat down with Arianna Huffington, the founder and also the publisher earlier of Huffington Post, to get her insights as a prolific author and international media mogul. Geopolitics these days, unfortunately, is playing a much bigger role than it should. And we have seen that tendency becoming ever bigger over the past few years. Let's just say what's going on between the two largest economies in the world. So Arianna, when we talk about bringing back the core within ourselves, when we talk about make sure it is about the peace and development for all, are we really talking about wishful thinking?
Basically, when you have a superpower being challenged by the rise of a growing power, the United States being challenged by China, what you need more than anything is wise leaders. Only wise leaders can stop a catastrophe. And wise leaders and wise citizens are the only way to stop what otherwise would happen if we listen to the citizens.
What's your interpretation of wise?
Going back to history, there's so much in Chinese history, going back to the Song dynasty, 2,000 years, and looking at what was called then rival partners. You can be partners even while you are rivals. You can have differences even while you are working together. That is the constraint that we need now. And only wise leaders can stay within the boundaries that will prevent not just a trade war, but a catastrophic war.
Arianna, you've been working in the media as a most well-respected flag, I would say, one of those. And now you left to a certain extent to what you are doing right now. So probably when you are outside the mountain, you could see the mountain even clearer than you are inside. What exactly the media's role these days?
Well, unfortunately, the rise of social media has made it much easier to play to people's prejudices and to reinforce the worst in human beings. So it becomes all the more important for mainstream media to stay absolutely categorically, clearly just on the facts and on good reporting, because otherwise people are so confused about where the truth is, where the facts are. So it is the role of media to stay very closely on that. And at Thrive Global, you know, my new media platform, we look at what is happening in the world every day, but we do it from the point of view of standing back and looking at the whole picture, not getting lost in covering every presidential tweet and basically being caught in the constant cycle of outrage, which depletes our energy and makes us much less likely to achieve results.
But when you look at it, the facts are the hardest thing to get these days.
Facts are not hard to get. Facts get confused because of fake news, as the president calls it. But there are many, many U.S. media players that are doing amazing reporting and that are bringing the facts out. There's no absence of facts. We just need to be very cognizant of where the facts are to be found and not to be manipulated.
In this part of the world, there's always concern whether the share of arguments and the share of facts that is valued in this part of the world could get across to the other parts of the world, for example, to the United States. And the other side, I guess, also have similar feelings, if not of the same degree. Arianna, what do you make of this scene, particularly now when the bilateral relations is getting ever more intense?
What is important is to recognize that there are many people on both sides that want to achieve that possibility of rival partnership. If you go back to the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Jack Kennedy recognized that if he could not change the relationship with Russia, they could blow up the world, and that it was his responsibility to help create a world where they could coexist. And really we're at a similar moment. And you know, it's never everybody who recognizes the truth. We just need a critical mass of leaders, a small critical mass of leaders in both countries.
In 2015, Ms. Huffington launched the online site Huffington Post, which was later ranked among the most powerful blogs in the world. Ms. Huffington herself has also been recognized in various media outlets, appearing on Time magazine's top 100 list and Forbes' special rundown of the world's 100 most powerful women. But recent years, she announced that she would leave the Huffington Post after 11 years there and launch Thrive Global, a startup company and digital platform dedicated to health and wellness. Advocating that burnout is not the price we must pay for success, Ms. Huffington tries to draw people's attention now to their well-being. Which stage are we in terms of our understanding of our life cycle, particularly how we can deal with the stress?
Well, I believe this is an incredible inflection point where we need to understand that when we take care of our well-being and give ourselves time to recharge while working hard and achieving, we are going to be more productive, our performance will improve, so that it has benefits not just for the individual but for corporations and for the country. I learned from my own wake-up call. You know, I was living life without recharging, always working not just hard, I always work hard, but not smart. You know, working so many long hours that you suffer from diminishing returns. In 2007, when I collapsed from burnout and sleep deprivation, hit my head on my desk, broke my cheekbone, and that was the beginning of my looking at all the latest science and recognizing that, in fact, I was ignoring the latest data, and I was acting as though I were a machine. And the goal with the machine is to minimize downtime. But the human operating system is different. But we also see, like Kai-Fu Lee, you know, he had his own wake-up call when he was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma cancer. And he wrote after that, and I quote him in my book, Thrive, how that changed his life because he realized that he had distorted priorities.
Exactly. But you know, China is in a drastic changing time. You could argue also very similarly in the other parts of the world. So how can people be able to put the health as a priority and streamline their life as a result?
I think the first thing is to change beliefs by going back to the Chinese roots. The wisdom is here. You don't have to import it from any other country.
You don't.
It's all here. If you look at the Taoist concept of yin-yang, for me it captures everything. Yang is you go out and conquer. China has a long way to go to keep growing, to keep innovating, to keep raising people out of poverty. All that is in China's present and future. But it can do it in a sustainable way by also taking care of the yin part, which is the refueling part. So yang, you go out and conquer. Yin is you come back and refuel. That's all we're saying. We are not saying don't go out and achieve. We're not saying don't create transformational growth. We are actually saying that the growth will be much more transformational and sustainable if we also take care of our human capital, which is the most precious resource.
You've been living in the United States for decades. So do you notice also a similar period of time that can be comparable in U.S. history, for example, and that of what China is going through right now, and how is stress and dealing with stress in a way help to solve the problem?
Actually, I think that the United States is going through a similar period right now. And the United States needs to also tap into its own sources of wisdom.
What is it then? Do you see it?
You have an enormous amount of Western culture, from my fellow Greeks, Socrates and Plato, to the Stoic philosophers, and they all said the same thing in different ways as the Chinese philosophers, which is that if we don't take time to recharge and tap into our own sources of wisdom, we are going to be operating on the surface, and we are going to be operating from the worst part of ourselves, the least wise part of ourselves. And that has terrible consequences, both in our own lives, but also for the country. And if you look at the incredible increase in mental health problems here, depression, anxiety, chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension, this has an impact on the economy. It has an impact on healthcare costs, and it has an impact on the productivity of human capital.
You have been facing setbacks throughout your life, while you have been also achieving tremendously. Failing to run for the governor of California, 30 refusals for your second book from the publishers.
36 refusals.
Oh my God, my dear. Okay, so what is it that make you be able to come out and always make sure you get your message to the other parties?
Well, I was very lucky to have an amazing mother, and I know you had an amazing mother. I loved the piece you wrote about her. And what you described about your mother, her ability to tap into her own inner strength through incredibly difficult times, so much more difficult than anything you or I have been through. And part of that is to recognize that failure is not the opposite of success. That's what my mother used to say to me. Failure is a stepping stone to success. And that's where tapping into our own inner wisdom and resilience and strength comes into it, because that makes it much more likely that we'll be able to get up again and move on to greater things.
You've been thriving on top of fear, but for most of people, this is such a challenge, for women particularly.
I think it's very important to talk about women, because women are suffering much more from this culture of burnout, because women are still, in the majority of cases, the primary caregivers at home,
yes,
as well as elder parents. And so if we really want women to have equity, we need to realize we have to change the culture of burnout. Otherwise, we will keep going to Davos every year and looking at the data, and it's not budging.
No.
In fact, the progress of women has stalled. And for me, it will never really change fundamentally if we don't change that culture of stress and burnout.
People have too much demands for women. They want to have them to look wonderful all the time and work as hard and probably even harder than the other side of the gender, and also be a very loving and successful and capable mother at home. It's impossible, others argue. You argue about life-work balance is actually make them as one.
Yes.
Do you still hold on to that?
Yes, I don't believe in the term work-life balance. That's not really what we need. What we need is work-life harmony, work-life integration. I love the concept of wu-wei. Can you say it in a proper Chinese accent?
Yeah.
You know, W-U-W-E-I. You know, the concept of flow and harmony,
Yes.
and acting without stress and burnout. I
Wu
think
Wei.
Wu-wei. Wu-wei is a very powerful concept. That's what we need to bring back. It's not about balance. It's about operating from a place of harmony within yourself. And from that place, you don't get depleted. You don't get exhausted. And that's what your ancestors have taught us. So we need to actually acknowledge that and integrate it into our lives.
Are we smarter?
We may be smarter, but that doesn't matter if we're not wiser. The problem is not IQ. The problem is wisdom. That's what's missing.
From Wu Wei to the ultimate wisdom, Arianna Huffington. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. It's a weekend. Have a great one, everyone.